Hi, nice to meet you all. My name is Dejan. I am a keen ornithologist. I come from Slovenia, and today I'm gonna take you on a journey on two really interesting topics in every bird's life. One of those topics is migration, and honestly I would much rather be observing it outside, but instead of being trapped inside in here. And the other one is molting, which really comes in handy for me as in a personal life, because I'm also a bird ringer. I'm obliged to tell you that at any point, if you have any questions about my presentation, any question that arises during the presentation, just don't hesitate to put it in a chat, and at the end I'll try to answer as much of them as I can. So if nobody has anything against, I think I will just dive into the lecture. So birds, they're either interesting, mysterious, beautiful colored, cute. You can name a lot of stuff that we love about birds, but at the end we all come to the same conclusion. They fascinate us, they enrich our lives, and for some of us it's also a livelihood. And me, on my journey as an ornithologist, I found out, as many others also do, that in the tropics birds tend to be more colorful, more exotic, even strange than in northern latitudes. Even in the northern latitudes we have a lot of colorful birds, but as a general rule many of them are more colorful in the tropics. I was fortunate enough to spend some time in the tropics and to get to know some of the birds, some of the more colorful birds. But in my now quite some years of bird watching, I came across a very not really colorful bird, but the bird that has quite a lot of meaning. Early on, in Slovenia, that bird was relatively rare, mostly because we weren't used to hunting for the bird by sound. We were just trying to determine it by sight, and the bird tends to stay in the among the grass, so it's quite hard to see. So it was a special bird just because of its rarity. As I mentioned, later on I was in the tropics. Specifically, in this case, I was in Ethiopia, so in Eastern Africa. And while I was there, I saw a lot of interesting, big, colorful birds. And among them, on some lakeshore, I saw the same bird. And even then, that single bird struck me as the most interesting thing I've seen there. Few years later, I saw the same bird in the North Scandinavia on its breeding ground, and I had the opportunity to follow the same, not the same individual, but the same species all through its stages of life. So it's breeding in the North Scandinavia. The bird, so I still didn't reveal the name. It's a red-throated pipit. Very well, as a bird, it's not really special. It's camouflaged colors. Besides just this pink throat, there is not much color on it. But I've managed to see that bird in the breeding grounds, during the migration, and on the wintering grounds. And that bird is one of the things that started to fascinate me, to draw me into a stage of life that is dynamic, it's very colorful, and it's sometimes really impressive. Not just by all the facts that we know about migration, but just sheer volume can sometimes fascinate us. So quite a long time ago, as I I started to get my interest in migration. Now, what is migration? Most of us get to know migration just simply by statistics. So we have birds that migrate such a long distance, so high, in such numbers, or they spend their life migrating, and so on. So we'll touch some of the statistics, but for now, let me show you. So the bird on the slide is Arctic tern, and considering the distance the bird flies, that's definitely a champion. It migrates for 60,000 kilometers each year, and in their life, they're more than, if they would combine the length of their yearly migration routes, they would definitely reach Moon and probably back. So that's definitely a species worth mentioning. But as I said, we are keen to search for extremes, because extremes is what fascinates us, something that we cannot achieve. As I said, 60,000 miles Arctic tern, so almost 100,000 kilometers in a single year. Not very far behind is Sooty Shearwater, but very high up is actually another interesting bird, which I'll reach later. It's a northern wheatear. But when we talk about extremes, it's hard not to mention this one. This is a wader from that breeds in northern tundra in North America, also in in Alaska, in tundra in Canada, North Europe, and in North Siberia. And all of them have quite a long journey, but one in particular population has the longest journey. So this population of bar-tailed godwit that breeds in Alaska starts their migration by picking up a lot of food, gaining a lot of weight, and just starting off to almost nowhere, flying 13,000 kilometers from Alaska over the ocean non-stop, and reaching New Zealand or Tasmania at the other side. As I said, not stopping, just flying. And it's an impressive feat that's almost unimaginable for us. Even more impressive is that it takes only 11 days for that bird, and on the other hand, that means that in 11 days that bird flies continuously, doesn't feed, doesn't sleep as it would on the ground, just flying. So impressive as it is. As I mentioned before, the top on the list among the passerine is northern wheatear. It's an interesting species that tells us something about how migration evolved or progressed. So this is a bird that is moving in direction of northeast and also northwest, or east and west, from its main breeding areas. And it already reached from Europe over to Greenland, and it already breeds in the northeastern Canada, and it already reached the other side. So going to the east, it reached Alaska. And both of those populations migrate back again to northern Africa, or to sub-Saharan Africa, meaning that with each year that the breeding area is further away from its wintering ground, meaning that it builds the record even further. One of the most interesting questions that we're dealing with this bird, apart from the whole process of migration, is what will happen when those two populations, so from northeastern Canada and Alaska, will meet. If they will know each other as the same species, they will probably interbreed. And if we learn something from the genetic imprint of the migration, they might even start migrating to South America, which is in between. So they have genetic memory. So the one from northeast Canada is migrating east, and the one from west Alaska is migrating west. So that's mostly imprinted. When we are talking about migration, we need to ask ourselves a few simple questions, just like as we were children. And why not? Children pose some of the most interesting questions, and the more difficult it is to answer the question, the more interesting the question is. So what, why, where? What is a migration? We tend to think that migration is moving, it's massive movement of birds, and it is. But not all movements are considered migration. So migration is constant, so repeatable movement of larger mass of birds from particular place to another place and back again. So it's the same, it's like a circle. If the circle is broken or it's just in one way, it is not migration. And among migrants, we have very different birds. So on the one spectrum, we have these record holders like northern whittier, bar-tailed godwit, Arctic tern that migrate really long distance, and we call them long distance migrators. On the other hand, we have birds that move only short distance, and thus we call them short distance migrators. Where we draw the line, it's not really clear, but I will show you a few examples how two different groups look like. We also have partial migrants, which means that only a part of the population moves southwards or northwards if we are on the southern hemisphere. And we have eruptive migrants, which means that we have birds that migrate in certain years where there is let's say, a huge production of seeds in the northern forests, and afterwards, when the food is running low, they have a strong migration to south. And in the year where there is almost no food, low production of birds, there is almost no migration. So first I'll show you just a simple interactive map of long distance migrants. You can see the darker the color, the bigger the density of birds, so the higher the number. And you'll see how the big mass of birds just goes from north to south and back again. So this is a barn swallow, bird that lives all across the globe. And it moves north in the spring, so now they're already returning. And in the summer, late summer, they begin to go down, and at the end, they reach wintering grounds, and in the next year, they repeat the process. On the other hand, we have also another small bird that moves much shorter distance. So if we had before the barn swallow that migrates, let's say, from northern United States to southern South America, or in case of Europe, from the northern Europe to the southern tip of Africa, so that's several thousand kilometers away. We have white-eyed vireo that moves only perhaps 100 kilometers or so, or several hundred kilometers, which is still impressive, still long, but considerably shorter than barn swallows. So again, denser the colors in the winter. Now they're moving up, reaching the entire breeding area, and in autumn going down. And if you paid attention, you can see that when the time of the migration starts, a lot of birds just go together. So they don't go one by one, but at some point where the conditions are right, depending on the weather, but mostly on the length of the day, they just massively migrate. So that is a migration. the round loop that is repeatable year after year. Now, another very important question: why do birds migrate? Well, unlike us, where we go to vacation to take the time off, they actually have very good reasons to migrate. And most people from the northern latitudes think of the frost, the freezing snow, the cold. Cold has something to do with it, but mostly indirectly. So most birds in the northern latitudes leave their breeding grounds not because it gets cold and they will be cold themselves, but simply because cold means that they will run out of food. If we think of barn swallows, they hunt mainly for flying insects, and winter doesn't provide that. So in cold weather, insects are inactive, hiding or hibernating, or just waiting for the next season, meaning that all those birds that feed on insects need to move away. So this is one reason for migration. So getting away because you are running out of food. So moving to the climates and the areas where the food is more readily available. But on the other hand, we have migrants that are moving towards the places where food becomes more available, like grasslands and especially deserts. Birds tend to fly in certain direction and year after year, and birds from the same area, let's say from Central Europe, tend to migrate to the same area in Africa. And if you go across the Atlantic, birds from eastern United States fly in different pathways or to different wintering places than do the birds from North America. And if we group if we group birds in groups from where they are going to where they are where they are coming to where they are going, we can actually draw a map. And that map, as you can see beside me, is actually those areas, those polygons of different colors are called flyways. And you can see that America has 3 flyways, Europe has 2 major flyways, and Asia has 3 of them. So, and you can see that some of them start at the same place and they go to the same place and they are using the same migration routes. So this is really important, mainly for conservation purposes. Some of the birds populations in flyways are in worse condition than others. In some cases, they are even the populations are going up, and it's really important to stay on top of which birds are belonging to which flyway, so we can act appropriately. And when the birds are moving from north to south, or from south to north, or from northeast to southwest, they may come across some difficulties, obstacles, something they need to conquer. And in case of a lot of birds, mainly diurnal raptors, storks, pelicans, many of them are unable to travel across the sea, so they are concentrating on land masses. And because they are going from very wide areas to concentrating to very narrow areas, like a bottle, that's why we call those areas bottlenecks. And there's no coincidence that I put this black stork on the photo for 2 reasons. First of all, it kind of reminds us of a bottle. So you can see that it goes from wide to very narrow. And on the other hand, it's one of those birds that needs bottlenecks in order to cross, let's say, from Europe to Africa. As I said, the definition of bottleneck is pretty straightforward. In case of North America, so for some species, it gathers the entire population across the 2,500 miles that takes from one ocean to the other, and concentrates them to very, very narrow area in the middle, in Panama, that's only 60 miles across. This has several interesting effects. One of them is that if you have the opportunity, please go to Panama City when the raptors are migrating south, simply to enjoy the mass of raptors that are circling above the city. But birds are not only concentrating on the land, they are also concentrating along the sea. So water birds and seabirds don't tend to stay away from the land, so they migrate along the coast, and at some cases concentrate in high numbers, and vice versa. A lot of land birds tend to concentrate along the coast simply just because they're following it. And the third areas where we can say that there are bottlenecks are mountains. If you go to the mountains, it takes you quite a lot of energy to reach the top of the mountain, and people are keen to go on top of the mountain, me included. But birds, they're crossing the mountains, mostly birds that, and a lot of them are passing the mountains in perpendicular way. They do not wish to exert more energy that they need during the migration, so they are searching for passes, mountain passes, and they concentrate there. In some cases, those mountain passes can funnel hundreds of thousands of birds during the migration. Bottlenecks are not always openly looked like upside down bottle as in North America. You can see that in the case of Europe and Africa, when birds are crossing from one way to another, there are several key points where they concentrate. One of them is on the western side between Spain and Morocco. It's an sea strait that covers several 10 kilometers, which is very narrow. And this is very important for birds. As I said, some of them don't like to cross the sea, mostly raptors, as I said before, but that's because they are depending on thermal winds, and thermal winds only are only produced above land. So above the sea, they need to fly actively, and big birds are in disadvantage because they need to spend a lot of energy for active flight. So that's on the western side. In the middle of the Mediterranean, we have several islands, and the closest to Africa is southern Italy, that with the jump from Sicilia, Malta, and few small islands, it's very relatively close to Tunisia. And on the eastern side, there are straits of Bosporus and Dardanelles, and more south through Israel. And the picture that's on now represents birds stacked with satellite transmitters, which means that we were able to, I mean researchers, are able to follow it, to see where it goes, what strategies it takes, and some birds are constantly using the same bottleneck year after year, going to the same wintering grounds. But on the other hand, as you could see, the more purplish colored lines, some birds don't care and just fly across all Mediterranean, which is incredible achievement, and after that they fly over Sahara, which is even greater achievement. if you're lucky and you are at some of those bottlenecks, the mass of birds in certain days, so in certain type of weather, can be extreme. If we can just enjoy the mass of birds flying across, it's the feeling. It's hard to describe. It also gives me personally hope that there are still a lot of birds on the planet, on such places where the birds concentrate. It's really, really fascinating. Now we said that birds start on the breeding areas, fly south, southwest, southeast, north in some cases, and they end up in wintering areas. In rare cases, like as mentioned in bar-tailed godwit, they fly non-stop without any interruptions. But in some cases, actually in most cases, birds need to stop in between. Now we call those areas where they stop either stopover sites, which means, as it says, so they stop over, or staging areas where birds concentrate. And what they do there is rest, gain energy back, build up fat reserves, so they mostly rest and feed. Some birds, like this blackcap, are constant. When they land and they are really low on fat reserves, they need to build up the fat again in order to move further south. And when you see areas where birds are landing, so after, let's say, a strong opposite winds or after bad weather, they land somewhere, they explore the area a bit, but afterwards they just dive in and feed and feed and feed. As mentioned, the blackcap, when it migrates, it seldom has problems in Europe finding suitable places to feed. So if you're a forest bird and you live in forest, you breed in forest, and then you migrate and end up in the forest, and when you're migrating, you're going over the forest, you don't really need to pay attention where to land. You just, when you're tired, when you're low on the reserve, just land and start feeding. Or just find a certain place in the forest that suits you, that has enough food, and you just start eating. It's something completely different for, let's say, wetland species. They cannot land just anywhere. They need to feed within the wetlands, meaning that when they are migrating, they need to pay attention to where they are flying and where what are their fuel reserves, so they need to calculate where to land. Also, wetlands are not all the same, and for some species, certain wetlands are really not appropriate, so they need to find a way to find specific wetlands. Also, as it happens, wetlands are really in poor state across the globe, so those species have even harder job to find their suitable feeding areas. As I said, they fly there, they start feeding. A lot of them, especially waders, ducks, swans, they can concentrate in high numbers in such staging areas. So if you want to evaluate how the importance of wetlands, there is breeding importance. You can have a lot of breeding birds there as protected species. You can have wintering area, so a lot of wintering birds, and you also can have staging area, so birds come to stop there on their migration, build up their reserves, and move forward. When you go to breeding area, you simply stroll through the area a few times, count the birds, and you can estimate how many of them are breeding. You also know which one which species are breeding. The same goes to in the winter, but in the winter you tend to use more visual cues, so you count them and you say, okay, so and so many are wintering there. Staging areas are a bit different because birds interchange there daily. So if you have 100 bar-tailed godwits one day and 100 the next day, it does not mean that they are the same birds. So it is much more difficult to evaluate the importance of a staging area. Now we return to bar-tailed godwit. As I said, on their southward migration, they move a huge distance in one go. This is possible because they have a help of tailwind, at least for the part of the journey. But on the return migration, the winds are not optimal, so they need to fly. They need to take a bit different strategy. But also, very importantly, when they are wintering the southern hemisphere, they have no clue what the weather is like on their breeding grounds. But they must not. They must time their arrival perfectly. Now, if you want to time your arrival without any clue what's happening on the other side of 12, 15, 13,000 kilometers away, you might have a problem. So it's much easier to evaluate the state of spring if you move on the northern side to the north. You also complete part of the journey, so it's much easier. Build fat reserve on a staging area in between, and then move to the breeding grounds where it is much more likely that you time your arrival more perfectly. So not only birds fly a long distance, the feats that they achieve are incredible. Even though they are really superb beings in face of migration, the strategies, they also face a lot of dangers. One of the dangers is, of course, not building enough fat reserve. Imagine that bar-tailed godwit flying from Alaska to Tasmania and at some point running out of fuel. It has no way to land apart from the ocean. If it gets exhausted, it cannot continue. It's almost impossible for it to find a land. So that's one of the things that birds really need to be very careful when they embark on the migration. If their fat reserves are okay, if they know where to go, so that's really, really important. But nonetheless, even though they are perfectly engineered to fly from, let's say, New Jersey to Brasilia, they still can face some incredible dangers that are really something they did not count on. For example, strong opposing winds, bad weather that can stay for a long period. In these cases, the birds can be flown, pushed away in completely different directions, so they even lose their way. So that's part of the challenges of being a bird on migration. On the other hand, bird migration is a good opportunity also for predators, which is bad news for migrating birds, but some predators took advantage of the problems migrators face. In Europe, in Mediterranean, there is one species of falcon, Eleonora's falcon, that actually not only specialized on hunting migrants, it also moved its breeding period. So most predators that breed in Europe breed from February to, let's say, July, June. But Eleonora's falcon has a peak breeding season with the biggest demand for food in August, September. when it's rearing its chicks, and that's also the time when northern migrants are going to Africa. They try to cross the Mediterranean, and if they get exhausted, if they get off course, they try to land on the islands, and inaccessible islands is where Eleanor's falcon is waiting for them. So it means that if you have a species that is specialized on that, it also means that there is a lot of birds that get into trouble. We also have a predator in northern side of the Mediterranean that didn't change its breeding season, but also it's highly dependent on spring migrants. It's peregrine falcon. It's a species very well known across the globe. It's actively hunting birds that are exhausted on their northbound migration, and we have another species of falcon on the African side doing the same. But those are specialized predators hunting for birds and only birds. But we have, in some cases, also very generalist feeding birds like gulls, crows, that also take advantage of migrating birds. Very exhausted small passerine is no match for, let's say, yellow-legged gull or black-headed gull, if we're talking about Mediterranean. I'm gonna share a small, short story, personal story about observing such difficulties of birds on the border between Albania and Montenegro, where I monitored the migrating birds. Most of the birds that we saw were either waders or waterfowl. But we also saw a lot of passerines. Now, passerines are mostly migrating during the night, so when we came in the morning, we saw a few of them arriving. If they were arriving in morning, means that they were being late on the sea for various reasons, either wind, rain, or simple exhaustion. And me and my friends that were there, we witnessed several predations of gulls of passerines, so we knew what they were facing. The story is about a small bird, as on the picture, a European robin. Me and my friends saw a small dot approaching from the sea. By the way it was flying, just a side note, European robins are not really adapted to long distance flying. They are not really graceful at it, so it's quite easy to recognize them when they're flying from afar. So we saw that dot approaching, and we just were looking at it as it approached, and around 100 meters from the coast it landed on the sea. We thought, okay, so this one is definitely a goner. It's a forest bird. The weather will get wet, and it will definitely not survive. We already started to make a note in our notebook when we saw that it flew up again. It flew very low above the water, and it was flowing. So it made our hearts jump. We stayed on the bird. We encouraged her in our hearts, of course, go. But then, about 10 meters before the coast, before the shore, it landed again on the water. It just stayed there, and both me and my friend started to run toward the sea. Mind you, the sea had less than 16 degrees Celsius, so it wasn't very appealing to go in, but we were both prepared to go in. And as we approached the coastline, so the bird flew once more, and it landed just on the first on the first sandbar, maybe 1 to 3 meters from the sea. And it was completely exhausted. How exhausted it was, so that's the bird on the photo. The bird from the story, it's on the slide. And we took pictures from a meter away. It was totally oblivious of us. It was breathing heavily, and it was just almost passive. It took her 10-15 minutes of just resting before it flew again in the first bushes and just stayed there. But this one was lucky. A lot of them land kilometer away from the ocean, from the coast, and are permanently lost. So we have dangers that are posed by people, by nature, and by the feats that are also very incredible. So just the idea of traversing 11,000 kilometers by itself, it's exhausting, and it's full of dangers, as we've shown. But what's even more important, that every year more dangers are posed by people, either through simple habitat destruction. For example, most problems are caused for migrants on staging areas. Tidal shoreline is very important for a lot of birds. But on the other hand, climate is also changing. That brings out a lot of other problems, not only during the migration, but also, as I mentioned before, the timing of arrival on the breeding ground is also very crucial. So if the spring is more and more advanced, and if long-distance migrants are not able to adjust, the population is in decline. As we can see that long-distance migrants are in much worse state than resident or short-distance migrants, simply because the migration on the long distance is becoming more and more difficult, and the habitat is less and less suitable, but also because they are late on their breeding areas. Now, very shortly about how. We saw that bar-tailed godwit starts flying in Alaska and just follows a direction and lands on Tasmania. That's an island 13,000 kilometers away, and it lands there. So how does he do it? As mentioned before with the wheat ear, part of it's genetic. Some birds have their genetic imprint, so fly southwest or southeast. It's imprinted in them, and they're just flying there. It's also imprinted at approximately what date, so how short the day must be when they get traveling shivers. But that's just part of it. It's still very crude to follow southwest, but you still need to realize where the southwest is in order to stay in that direction. And birds tend to use a lot of cues from nature. Either they use the placement of the moon, the position of the sunset or the sun, or position of the stars, the geography of the landscape. Some of them also learn from other individuals in the species, or from adults. Certain species stay with parents until they come back to the breeding ground, so they learn the way. So they have a lot of different ways how they travel from one place to another. But that's it for migrating. and we'll go to molting. So molting is simply changing the feathers, either because you need a new one, or you need a new, or the opportunities or occasions are different. And we'll go through that a bit later. But I want to stress that if a migration is really demanding energetically, you also need to have in mind that breeding is really energetically demanding, and also that molting is energetically demanding. It's not just simply changing the feathers. You need to the birds need to gather a lot of energy in order to achieve that. So, as we all know, birds are covered with feathers, and feathers are some of the most durable organic matter produced by animals in the nature. In fact, they are so durable that in poultry farms, feathers is actually a huge problem as a waste because it decomposes so slowly. But nevertheless, even though it's very, very durable, it has problems. It is attacked by parasites, as in case of mites. They try to feed on the that try to feed on the feathers. But even more importantly, one of the biggest destroyer of feathers is actually UV light. You can see on this wing of rose-breasted grosbeak that you have old and worn feathers, new and crisp feathers, and then old and worn again. I like to point out that old and worn were as black as the new ones a year before. So this is what happens to a feather on a bird within 1 year. So you can see that UV has a huge impact on the feathers. Also, some feathers get damaged simply because birds live among dense vegetation, or they are attacked by predators. So various reasons the feathers get damaged. And birds need their feathers. Without the feathers in their prime state, they have difficulties flying, which means that they cannot get enough energy for migration, for breeding, and also it means that they are easier to catch for predators. So one of the reasons to change your feathers is to get a new one. As mentioned, they get damaged. You need a new one, and constantly. But there are also other reasons for birds to change feathers. One of them is changing from juvenile feathers to adult feathers. Now, why that's important? For two reasons. First reason is that juveniles tend to be more camouflage colors. Adults, on the other hand, in case of European robin again on top, tend to be more flashy. Flashy for to getting a mate, to defending a territory, but on the other hand, inexperienced juvenile needs to stay more hidden, stay more below the radar, so the camouflage colors are more appropriate for it. The other reason is that young birds need to spend as little time as possible in the nest, which means that the first feathers they grow need to grow as fast as possible. And when you do something really fast, you also do a lot of mistakes. So the young feathers are usually not optimal, so they need to change it. And they usually, in most species, they change it before they start migrating. So somewhere in the autumn, between the breeding period and autumn migration. The other reason for changing the feathers is simply because the environment changes. As in the case of ptarmigan, during the winter there is snow around and everything is white. The species lives in the tundra and in the high mountains where the winter is long and very, very white. And if you are black or dark gray or anything else but white on the white background, you're very easily seen by predators, which means that you are easy target. And vice versa. During the summer, the lichens and grasses are more grayish, brownish, greenish color, and if you're white on that landscape, again you stand out and you're a very easy target for predators. So it's simply they need to change their feathers just to stay alive. Now, changing the feathers, birds use very different strategies. Some of them, as I said, after the breeding, they change their colors into adult plumage or to the next phase. Some, like the indigo bunting here, males get their male plumage over the winter with small blue feathers popping up all around, and not in the winter but in the next spring, so new dots appear and they slowly change their feathers from brown to blue. On the other hand, we have starlings, not very favorable birds in some parts of the world, but very interesting in the in molting circles. They change their feathers only once a year, so that happens in autumn, and juveniles and adults change their feathers in autumn, and they in October and September are inseparable. Just by looking at them. And they all look the same, like the top bird with white spots. In spring, without changing their feathers, they all look like bird down. So no white spots, glossy, some would even say sparkly. And that happens without changing the feathers. In the winter, they have an extra isolation on top of the feathers that is actually quite easy to abrade. And this is what actually happens. They get new feathers in autumn, they slowly abrade it to spring, and in spring they are blackish without that white spots. Feathers are really costly to make, and bigger the bird, more energy they need to put into a feather. As I said, all birds change their feathers at some point, and small birds change their entire plumage at least once a year. But bigger birds cannot do that simply because it's too energetically demanding. So what do? They changed feathers over. They stretch the change of feathers over several years. The bigger the bird, the longer the stretch. So in the case of golden eagle, that time period is 6-7 years. So in that 6 years, they change the entire plumage, and especially the flight feathers, which are the biggest and the most important for a predator to have. So on the schematics there, you can see that you have old feathers, feathers that are 1 year old, 2 year old, 3 year old, 4 year old, and up to a certain age, this is how you can actually age a big raptor. Because if it takes him 6 years to change all of the flight feathers, it means that until the 6th year, it has the 6 year worth of different feathers. And if you remember for a few slides back, UV light also works highly on the feathers here. The new feathers, new fresh feathers, are all very, very dark brown, and old feathers get really, really light. So you can see the transition, and if you have 2, 3 colors or 2, 3 age feathers, it means that the bird is 3 years old, and if you have 6, it's 6 or more years old. Other big birds take another strategy. Practically all waterfowls change in all fly feathers in one stage. We have a mallard on the picture, and mallards, both females and males, are very ground color looking in the summer. In the winter, the males are flashy, but during the summer you can separate them mostly by only by bill color, but the feathers are similar. The reason is this, that males as females drop all of the fly feathers, and for 14 days in the midsummer they are unable to fly. For them, unlike for raptors, which would mean that they would starve for 14 days, for ducks this is not really an issue, because they are in the middle of the high productivity season in a habitat that is really, really good for them. So they simply stay among the reeds or somewhere hidden out of sight, but still on the wetlands, just feeding around. So as I prepared the slides, I think this is it, and I am ready for any questions you might have, and I hope I got some questions prepared. Okay, so the first question is, do young birds learn their migration path from older birds, or is the knowledge of where to go instinctive? So both is true. Some birds, especially the bigger ones, learn from their parents. So birds like cranes, swans, geese, they learn from their parents. Smaller birds like passerines, some of them have instinctive knowledge. So as I said, it's in genetics. Some birds learn on the go. Some smaller raptors, I will just say I will show an example from Europe. Some, let's say, honey buzzards that fly from Europe to Africa. Adult birds strictly use bottlenecks, as opposed to young birds that migrate almost 1 month later than adults, can move anywhere from Gibraltar to Israel, so they can also traverse the Mediterranean. But if they survive, on the return migration, they tend to stick to the bottlenecks, and they don't make the same mistakes. So I hope I answered the question. Okay, so yeah, so I have another question. Would a single bird that got left behind be able to migrate on its own, or do birds rely on the collective knowledge of the flock to find their way? Yes, depends on the species. As I said, some species, in some species families migrate, so in those species birds don't really get left behind. Usually the entire family stays until the one that's weak builds up its energy again, and they follow the flock. In case of, let's say, waders that are that migrate in groups but don't really migrate in family groups, the birds will be left behind simply because the drive within the bird is strong to migrate. So they don't have this physical, emotional attachment to bird left behind. And the bird left behind has several options. So if it's able to rebuild its energy and to get better and to be able to migrate, it has, as I said, several options. There is an option for another group to fly by, so they just attach to another group, which actually happens quite a lot in, let's say, waders or waterfowl, smaller waterfowl. They concentrate on staging areas, and they can simply just stay with the flock that arrived later. For some birds, this means that they are left behind. They have an option to migrate by themselves, and it's more dangerous, and not all of them are able to get through. Okay, another question: will a bird migrate to the same bird feeder? Yes and no. Some birds, like European robin, have winter territories, and the knowledge that was gathered by bird ringing actually says that the same bird can come to the same feeder year after year after year. So as long as it is alive, it will probably go to the same feeder. Again, the same goes, let's say, for chickadees, titmice, tits. They all can remember the location of the feeder. They may not stay there the whole winter, but they may remember the location of the feeder, and they may come even during the same winter several times, and also in the next winter. So yes, but for some animals, they are just some birds are just passing through, and in case of those, they will not come to the same feeder intentionally. Okay. So the next question, which is addressed to the molting part of the lecture: I often see male cardinals with bald heads. Is this normal molting, or could it be caused by parasites? Normal molting, when we say that the bird changes feathers, it changes one feather at a time. So normally it never loses more than few feathers in the same place. In certain individuals, which happen to be more common in certain species, like northern cardinals, after breeding, before the molt, usually it's combined with stress, which could be parasites. They lose all of the feathers on the head. Why only head feathers and not somewhere also on the body? I don't know. But no, it's not normal molting. It's caused by stress, and they regrow their feathers, so everything is okay. It is happening often enough in cardinals, so we could say that it is normal, but yeah, as I said, it's not normal molting. Okay, so I've been let know that there are no more questions. So we have a few seconds if you have burning questions somewhere, but otherwise we will slowly end the lecture and the Q&A. And thank you all for listening. It was a nice time for me. I hope you all enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.